Welcome back to the JavaScript Essential Training Series. I am Mike, your host, and in this tutorial we'll actually be looking at for loops in JavaScript. So let's talk about loops in JavaScript. Over the next few tutorials we'll begin discussing loops and how they are used in JavaScript. Similar to conditional statements, loops check for a condition, and if that condition is true, they'll execute a branch of code. Unlike conditional statements, the loop allows you to check for that condition more than one time before the code in the loop is actually exited. So we can actually go through that conditional check multiple times and execute that code multiple times inside the loop before it exits out. This can be very helpful when dealing with groups of variables inside of our applications. Loops will allow us to repeat a condition until that condition returns a false. Once the condition is false, we drop out of the loop and the normal code execution resumes. There are three kinds of loops that we'll study over the next few tutorials inside JavaScript. We have the for loop, the while loop, and the do while loop. And they all work in similar ways, but they all have some unique characteristics. They all have similarities, but they're used in different ways as we develop our JavaScript applications. The first loop we're going to look at is the for loop. If you need to run code a specific number of times, you'd use a for loop. The for loop is the most common loop used in programming. In the for loop, the condition is usually a counter, which is used to tell how many times the loop should run. So here's an example of the syntax. We have the keyword for, then we have the condition counter. You'll notice I've got a variable I which is equal to 0. Then I say if I is less than 10, and then I increment I. And what happens here is we actually run the code. We set the variable the first time. In this case, we set it to 0. Then we say is I less than 10. If I is less than 10, we run the code between the curly braces. Then we increment I with that I++. So the code to be executed is inside the curly braces, and we also have an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace that actually make up the syntax. There are three things that make up the for loop syntax inside the parentheses. We have the initialization of the variable itself, then we have the condition that we're checking for, and then we actually update that particular counter. In this case, it's I. So let's move into our development environment and demonstrate what we talked about in the presentation. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. I'm going to drop into our development environment. First thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and confirm that we've got the Apache server up and running. I'm going to go ahead and bring in Sublime Text 3, which will be my text editor for the demonstration. And I'm going to bring up Google Chrome, which will be my Chrome browser, or the browser I'll be using for the demonstration. We're still in section 2 of our tutorial sections if you have copies of the exercise files. In this particular demonstration, we're actually just going to go through our for loop. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename my title, for loop. I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to save this as for_1.html. Save that file. Now I'm going to go back into our browser and go ahead and load that one up. And I'm going to put an H3 inside of our container. And I'm just going to say for loops. We're probably going to have a few demonstrations here. We're going to go ahead and close out that H3. Let's go ahead and save that change. Refresh our browser window. And now we know we're in the right file. Perfect. All right, so a for loop uses a counter as a condition. This is what we talked about in the presentation. This instructs the code to run a specified number of times based on that counter. We'll demonstrate for loops in our following demonstration, so let's look at our first example so you can see exactly what I mean by this. And I'm going to type it in from scratch so you can actually get a handle on what we're doing. It's not very long. I'm going to go ahead and get my opening script tag, put in my closing script tag, and come up inside there. I'm just going to type for. Let me go ahead and set up my formatting correctly. There we go. Then I'm going to open my parentheses, and in this particular example, I'm going to use an I for my variable. So I'm going to say variable I. I'm going to create the variable, initialize it as we talked about inside our presentation. I'm going to say variable I is equal to 0. And notice that I've ended that with a semicolon. That's very important. Each one of these little statements inside the parentheses is ended with a semicolon. Then I'm saying if I is less than 10, and again, end it with a semicolon. And then I'm going to take I, and if you remember from our operators, we can actually increment a counter inside of JavaScript by using that ++. I can increment by ++, decrement by minus. I'm going to go ahead and put some additional space between the parentheses so you see what's going on there. Then I'm going to do my opening and closing curly braces. Now inside the curly braces is the code that we're going to execute. And this is going to be a very simple one. I'm just going to document.write. And then inside my parentheses, I'm going to say I want you to print out the value of I. And on that, I want you to go ahead and add. So I'm going to use my addition character for my concatenation. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put in a line break so that we actually have a line break there. And then I'm going to end that statement in a semicolon. So let's go ahead and save all those changes. Great time to pause if you want to type this in. And what this is going to do, based on what we've done inside the for loop, I'm actually going to be printing out a counter to my screen. And as long as I is less than 10, it's going to print the number. When it becomes equal to or greater than 10, it's going to drop out of the code. And actually what I'm going to do down here, let's go ahead and put another document.write. Just so that we know when we're out of the code. And inside here, I'm just going to say exited the for loop. So you'll know that we're actually inside that loop while we're doing all the counting. And until we actually get to this point where I is not less than 10, this will not print. So let's go ahead and save all our changes. I'm going to refresh my browser window, and now you'll see I've got 0, 1, 2, 3. And remember, we started with the value 0. So it goes to 0. It looks at I and says, are you less than 10? And says, yes, you are because you're 0. Okay, print it to the screen and then add 1 to it. So it printed 0 to the screen, added 1 to it, and then ran through the loop again and said, are you less than 10? Yep, this time you're 1. So print it to the screen, add 1 to it, and then run through the loop again. And we did that till we got to the value of 9. And then you notice we exited the loop. Because once this became equal to or greater than 10, it exits that loop. So the loop is no longer a part of the execution of the code. Again, I want to point out the importance of the semicolons inside the for loop. That's usually the biggest bug I see as we're setting up or as people are learning to use JavaScript, and actually in most programming languages when they're learning to use loops, that's the biggest thing I see is they tend to forget those semicolons inside the loop itself, inside the parentheses. Next thing I want to point out, we talked about it in the presentation. This is the initialization part of the loop. This is where we initialize the initial value. We create a variable and set it to 0. The variable is commonly called I, and it acts as a counter. I is normally what I'll use to name the variable inside the counters, and actually it's pretty much common across all programming languages, and most people use I. Now we could use whatever we wanted, by the way. This could be anything we wanted as long as we match it inside the other conditions. The center group is the condition. This loop continues until the counter reaches a specified number. I could make this whatever I wanted to. If I made this 100 and save that change, guess what's going to happen? We're going to count up to 99. When I refresh the browser window and we could scroll down, we've got that went all the way to 99 before it exited out. It could be whatever value we want it to be or whatever value we need it to be. And in the next demonstration, you're going to see where we actually use an array, and we'll actually base that on the length of the array. And then the next one in our condition statement is the increment. This is where we actually update the counter. If we didn't have this there, we'd get into an endless loop. We have to increment that counter because eventually we want this condition to be met. If the condition's not met, we get into an endless loop, and that causes all kinds of problems with our browsers. It causes all kinds of problems with our PCs because it'll just run forever. And eventually it will take up all your resources and you get all kinds of problems. It's usually when we do that Alt Control Delete to get into the task manager and stop the process. So you always want to make sure you've got some way of incrementing the counter so you don't get into that endless loop. We can also increment this in other ways. Let's do another example. I'm going to go ahead and save all my changes that I've done so far, but I want to show you we don't have to increment by 1. We could actually go in here and say I equals I plus 2. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking the value of I, and instead of going or incrementing by 1, I'm actually incrementing by 2. So if I save that change, refresh my browser window, now you'll notice we go 2, 4, 6, 8. Because now we're incrementing by 2 instead of incrementing by 1. I've seen it done by 2s, by 3s, and again, it's depending upon the application and what you're doing, but you can have this increment in any types of values that you need it to for your particular application. Now you'll notice we got 3, 6, 9. Something else I see done quite frequently. Let's come down into my script. I'm going to create a variable. I'm going to call this variable count. and we'll say the variable count is equal to 12. And we'll end it with a semicolon. And then I can actually go into my for loop and say if I is less than count. Because now instead of actually looking for a value, I'm actually going to grab the value from this variable. I see this done quite frequently inside of loops, and not only in JavaScript, but in a lot of programming languages. Let's go ahead and save that change. Now we refresh the browser window. Again, we have 369. We didn't get to 12 because of our increment. Let's go ahead and take this out. Let's go with our plus plus because it didn't change from the last one. Save those changes, come in here, and now you'll see we actually go to 11. And again, now we're using the count variable as our counter inside of the for loop. So there's a lot of different things we can do. Let's look at another good example of how we use for loops inside of JavaScript. All right, so let's go ahead and do another example. This one's going to be a little more real world. I forgot I had that as a capital O. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as. Let's save this as for_2.html. I'm going to go in and load that one in my browser. And then I want to go ahead and remove this code. Let's take everything out of there that we had, and we're going to start from scratch. In this example, we're going to grab the elements inside of an array. And if you notice, about 3 or 4 tutorials ago, we actually covered arrays inside JavaScript. Arrays are extremely important. They're a group of variables that we store in one variable name, if you remember back from the tutorial. And we use arrays a lot in programming. The interesting aspect of this is that we'll not know the length of the array as we're actually putting the loop together. So we have to do something a little bit different because we don't know how many items are in our array. So I'm going to come down here, I'm going to create an array, and I'm going to copy this from my text file so you don't have to watch me type it. But I'm going to create an array, and it's going to be called cars. And I'm going to have 1, 2, 3, I've got 7 items inside this array. Perfect. And now what I want to do is I want to create a for loop that actually goes through and pulls out the values inside those arrays, or inside that array. So let's go ahead and set up our for loop just like we've done before. I'm going to open my parentheses, and I'm going to say for variable I, and that's going to be equal to 0. And I'm going to end that, oops, forgot to put the I there. I'm going to end that with my semicolon. I'm going to put those additional spaces in, even though they're not needed, just so it has a little bit of an extra space for clarity. Now comes the fun part, because now I say, okay, now I'm working with an array, and I don't know what the length is, and we all know that I've got to have that condition in there for this for loop to work correctly. So I'm going to say if I is less than, and we actually talked about this method inside of our arrays tutorial, cars.length. So what I've done is I've actually taken the cars array, and there's a method inside JavaScript that will give me the length of that array. So I'm saying as long as I is less than the length of the cars array, I want you to go ahead and perform or use the code below, and then I'm going to increment I. So we've set this up very similar to what we've done before, opening and closing my curly braces, and now I've actually got a pretty decent bunch of text here. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy this so you don't have to watch me type it. But in this one, I'm actually going to bring in document.write. The array includes, and then inside strong tags, I'm going to print the values of the cars that I have inside that array. And I do that by using I as the index number. If you remember back when we studied arrays, we talked about how index numbers are actually how we place these items inside of our arrays. So I'm actually going to use the value of I as the index number to print out the values that are inside the cars array. So I'm going to go ahead and save all those changes. And then I'm going to come down here, just like we had done in the previous exercise. I'm going to put in document.write, and then we've exited the for loop. So now you'll know when we're out of the actual loop itself. And we should stay in that for loop based on how the for loops work. We should stay there till we print out every value that's in the cars array. So let's go ahead and save all those changes. Great time to pause if you want to type it in. And again, don't forget, we're actually using our initialization, our condition, and our update. Here we're initializing the variable I. Here we're actually using the condition if I is less than the length of the cars array. And here we're actually incrementing I. So if it's less than the length of the cars array, we actually go in and execute this code that's inside our curly braces. Then we increment the value of I, and then we go and check this again. So it does this once. It goes and checks it every time, every iteration through until it returns a false. When it returns a false, it drops out. Okay, save all our changes. Let's go in and go back and load our for loop 2, and you'll notice now I've got all the names of the vehicles that are inside the array itself. Actually, let's put another line break down here so we can actually separate that from the actual values in the array. You'll see that now we print out all the values in of the vehicles in the array, and it shows us where we exited the for loop. The beauty of working with loops in arrays is if I change the value of this array, I don't have to touch my loop. I do not have to touch my for loop. And let me show you what I mean. I can actually add additional cars to this. Let's go ahead and add Acura. Put in a parenthesis, or put in a comma. Let's go ahead and add Audi. Another comma. Let's add another vehicle. We'll put in Bentley. Like I could ever afford a Bentley. We'll put in a comma, and then we'll add one more. We'll put in Fiat. I could probably afford one of those, but I'm not going to be able to be driving no Bentleys. Let's go ahead and stretch this out a little bit. So we've added 4 additional items to our array itself. Now I'm not going to touch the for loop, but because the way the for loop's written and the fact that we're using the cars.length of the actual array itself, it's going to update our array, or it's going to update our printout automatically when we execute the code. Let's go ahead and save all those changes. Great time to pause if you need to go ahead and type that in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh the browser window, and you'll notice now we've picked up the additional 4 cars from our array. And again, the reason being this is very dynamic because we're actually basing this on the length of the cars array, and it's not hard-coded in. Now we could have hard-coded it in. I could have actually come down here and I could have said length equals cars.length. Because remember, that's a built-in method inside of JavaScript. Then I could have just come right down here and said if I is less than length. Because I'm actually giving the value of the array, the length of the array is into a variable length. So I just say variable length equal cars.length. If I save that change, nothing should change inside of our browser because again, now I'm getting the length. I'm still using the same method, and I'm actually taking the length and using the length inside my for loop instead of using cars.length. So I mean, I've seen it done both ways. A lot of times people will do it this way so it's not as confusing to someone looking at the for loop, because when you start adding a long, especially if you have a long array, inside the for loop, it can actually confuse people when they're looking at the condition if they're not quite certain where all this text is coming from. So a lot of times they'll actually assign the length to a variable like we did right here, and then bring the variable into the for loop to make it a little bit easier for someone looking at the loop to understand what's going on. So that pretty much sums up how we use for loops inside of JavaScript. The next one we're going to look at is the while loop. And it's another really cool loop in JavaScript that allows us to do some interesting things that are a little different than how we use the for loop. So I look forward to seeing you in that tutorial.